was a life cut short. Martin Knight's new book, Justice for Joan, tells the story of one of the UK's most notorious cold case murders. Let him explain how he came to write about it.
Yeah, I think this story, not necessarily the book, but this story is very important because there's a number of themes, but principally there is the fight for justice that was carried out by Joan's family and Joan's friends, mainly Lena, that cascaded down the generations, really.
The August Bank Holiday Saturday of 1948 was to be the hottest day of the 20th century so far. London was hosting the Olympic Games and hundreds of thousands of people were descending from all over the UK to witness history being made. Joan Woodhouse, a 27-year-old Bloomsbury librarian living in YWCA digs in Greenwich, set off cheerfully that morning to go in the other direction, to visit her family at home in Barnsley, Yorkshire. She'd told them to expect her, but she never arrived. It appears that Joan travelled inexplicably instead to Arundel in Sussex. Her decomposing body was found 10 days later in Arundel Park in the shadow of the castle. She'd been raped and strangled, and so began a murder mystery that remains a cold case to this day. Inspector Fred Narborough of Scotland Yard was called in to assist the local police force in this rare countryside murder. He was joined by Dr. Keith Simpson, the celebrated Home Office pathologist, who concluded that Joan had been disturbed while sunbathing in the secluded Box Copse area, and when she'd resisted the advances of somebody, had been raped and strangled. Narborough immediately had a theory. He found in Joan's bag an address book that contained the addresses of scores of men. He felt that Joan may have been a good time girl and that she'd travelled to Arundel for a secret assignation, what would later be called a dirty weekend, and that foreplay with a gentleman friend had turned nasty. He declared to the press that the murderer was in this little book and he would eliminate men one by one, and it would be far easier if the killer came forward. Joan's family and friends, her father John, her two aunts, Ida and Annie, and her closest friend Lena Bamber, were aghast at this statement. Joan was deeply religious, actively involved in the Anglican Church and living by a self-imposed rule of life. It was unthinkable that she would contemplate sex outside marriage, or have a secret relationship, or say she was coming home when she had no intention of doing so. They pleaded with Narborough that he was barking up the wrong tree and implored him not to lose valuable detection time. In 2010, author of Justice for Joan, writer Martin Knight, met Lena Bamber, where she spoke about the case.
When I was a young boy, 16, 17 years old, a book came out called 40 Years of Murder, and it was written by the Home Office pathologist Dr. Keith Simpson, and it was a massive hit, and sort of unexpected hit, top of the book charts. And I used to read this book on the train on the way to work, about 1975 I think it was, and the case of Joan Woodhouse was one of the chapters, and it stuck in my mind for a number of reasons. One was it was unsolved. Most of the cases in that book were all solved. It seemed to tax Dr. Simpson. You know, you could tell he was not happy about the outcome. Joan was a librarian, and my parents were both librarians and had met in a public library. And the name Woodhouse was a family name, so it sort of stuck in my mind. Then many years later, coming up to 2010, I was playing around on Google, as you do, and the name came into my head, and I punched in Joan Woodhouse, and a letter came up from a lady called Lena Bamber, and she was writing to the Littlehampton Gazette. I think it was called, and she was thanking the people of Littlehampton and Arundel and the surrounding area, thanking them for remembering Joan on the occasion of the 60th anniversary of her death. And I wondered to myself, you know, who is Lena Bamber? Fairly unusual name, so I put that into Google, and an address and a phone number came up, and for some reason, I don't even know why I did it really, but for some reason I felt compelled to ring it. So I rang, and Lena Bamber answered the phone. She was clearly elderly, and I said the first thing that came into my head, which was I was a writer, which was true, but I was tentatively considering writing this story. And she said, "Oh, I've been expecting you. I knew you were going to call." I thought, "Oh God, you know, is she a crank?" And she said, "Yes, I knew you were going to call because I'm very old now. I'm nearly 90, and I prayed to God only just recently that before I leave this earth, I would get some justice for my dear friend Joan." So I was a little bit apprehensive, but she said, "Look, I'm too old to get down to London. Can you come up and see me in Derbyshire?" And I headed up to Derbyshire a couple of days later, and got to Lena's house. Very pleasant lady, very sharp. She was a former headmistress, and you could tell that. And she, within a few minutes, produced this brown leather suitcase with the initials JTW embossed on it. And it was Joan Woodhouse, Joan's father. It was his personal case of everything related to Joan's murder. And as I sort of unclipped the, to open the case, they creaked and lifted it up, and there was dust, and I was transported back to 1948. There were newspaper cuttings, certificates, council's opinions, countless letters that the Woodhouse family had written to very familiar establishment names I could soon see, and their replies. Inspector Narborough was incompetent, that's what Lena said to me. She said that he'd mucked up the investigation from the start, and rather than highlight his blundering, the police allowed a guilty man to roam free. She named this guilty man, and I said, "Look, you know, I can't say definitely here, but I will take this case away, I will study its contents, I'll do my own research, and then I'll let you know whether I can proceed with this book." And she said, "Yes, absolutely no problem. What is right, and we will get justice for Joan." That was it really from that first meeting. And I just remember it was dark when I left, and I got back on the M1, I think, and I remember just having this strong sense that a cobwebbed baton had been passed to me.
Narborough's ploughing through the address book and extensive house-to-house enquiries, reconstructions, and talking to potential witnesses were not getting anywhere. Indeed, it finally emerged that Joan was the secretary of a Librarians Association, and the names were all members. The detective needed to look elsewhere, and finally, 2 weeks into the investigation, he alighted on the local labourer who found the body, 24-year-old Thomas Stillwell. He said he found the body while taking a shortcut home from his doctor's. Box Copse was shortcut to nowhere. He then said that he was in Box Copse looking for rabbits, and he didn't want to admit that, as he and his family lived in a tied cottage on the Duke of Norfolk's land, and he didn't want to risk that tenancy. Narborough was a countryman and was at first inclined to believe him, but the local police felt there could be something with Stillwell, and Narborough had him in again, this time for a marathon grilling. Stillwell now admitted to following a girl on the Saturday, the suspected day of the murder. He identified her as Joan from a photograph. He placed her by Box Copse. He also said he was in the park that day with the intention of exposing himself to two young girls. He went as far as to break down and say, "It's my fault." When pressed, he said his following her had scared her into Box Copse, where she'd met her fate. Later he composed himself and then asked to look at the photo again, and then he said this was not the girl after all. Narborough was now convinced that Tom Stillwell was the murderer of Joan, but Stillwell had toughened up and was saying no more, and he had a solicitor present in all future interviews. The policeman told Joan Woodhouse and Joan's aunts that the evidence was circumstantial and he was not able to lay charges. Soon after, Scotland Yard announced that the investigation was closing. The Woodhouse family was appalled. The Yard was closing the investigation, yet they were not seeking anyone else in connection with the murder. The aunts and John Woodhouse hired a Bridlington detective to carry out his own investigation. Thomas Jacks was a no-nonsense former policeman in his 50s, more accustomed to divorce work. He came to Arundel and conducted his own investigation, unearthing witnesses who placed Thomas Stillwell in the park, indeed at Box Copse, at the time of the murder. He also found a witness who encountered Tom on the day of the discovery of the body. He told the witness that the body was that of a lady about 27. How could he have known this, posed Jacks, when the face was in an advanced state of decomposition? Due to the pressure from the new Jacks dossier, Scotland Yard reopened the case and sent down the legendary Inspector Spooner to conduct the new investigation. Spooner did so, but despite the now weightier circumstantial evidence, he too decided that there was not enough evidence to lay charges against the local man. The family were desperate and devastated. They were convinced that their beloved was being denied justice to spare Scotland Yard's blushes. They filed for a private prosecution for murder, a legal device that had been used only once before and would not be used again until the Stephen Lawrence case in recent times. This was the beginning of a David and Goliath battle between a quiet, religious northern family and the might of the British legal and political establishment. The establishment was not too happy at this development either. Private prosecutions for murder were on the statute book, but they didn't want them being used, as it had the potential to undermine police and legal decisions. Nevertheless, Stillwell was arrested and remanded in custody at Brixton Prison, pending a pre-hearing. The Crown, as was required by law, took charge of the prosecution and the case opened in the quaint Arundel Town Hall. Stillwell was brought down from Brixton Prison. Briefly, the eyes of the world were on the little Sussex town. It was soon apparent that the Crown didn't believe in the suspect's guilt, or didn't desire a guilty verdict, as it apologetically and limply made its case. After a few days of witness statements, the magistrates concluded that there was insufficient evidence to justify sending Thomas Stillwell to trial. They let him go. However, evidence about his motives for being in the park on both days was not heard, as his police statements were ruled inadmissible. No reference was made to a threat of an attack Stillwell had made to a local woman weeks before, when he'd asked her to strip and he threatened to throw her in the River Arun. Also, he had exposed himself to another young girl around the time of the murder. Here was proof that not only was Stillwell following girls, and most likely Joan, on the day of the murder, he was also in a sexually aroused and reckless state. None of this was aired in the courtroom.
During the writing of the book, I was more or less finished, and the most extraordinary coincidence or weird happening occurred. I had a friend I have a friend who lives in Battersea, and he knew that I had an interest in Battersea. My family ancestors all come from Battersea. My father came from Battersea, and I wrote a book called Battersea Girl about my grandmother who lived there for 100 years. And he said to me one day, I found this really good book about a man growing up in Battersea in the 1940s. And the book was called A Rose Beyond the Thames, and it was by Michael de Larabetti, an author I hadn't heard of. So I read this book, and he was spot on. It was a really, really good book. And I thought I must dig out anything else this chap's written. So I got on Amazon and I ordered 2 or 3 titles. One of the titles was called Fox's Oven, and it sort of rang a dull bell in my head, but I hadn't made any connection. And when it came, I went to bed that evening, started reading it, and I was just flabbergasted, because it was apparently a novel, but it was called Fox's Oven. Fox's Oven was the name of the house where Thomas Stilwell lived in Arundel. The book was set in Arundel. It was about an evacuee during the war. It described the main character's mother. They named her Agnes in the book, and that was Tom's mother's middle name. There was a sort of murderous son in the house, and there are many events and passages that link. If you knew about the case, you know, you can see clearly, you know, what's going on there. So it was just an extraordinary coincidence that this book should land in my lap while I'm writing a true account of a murder in Arundel. I found out that Michael de Larabetti certainly was evacuated to Arundel in the war, and whether he stayed at Fox's Oven, I don't know, or whether someone else he knew did, but he seems to have an intimate knowledge of the family dynamic, even as much as the father was an ex-naval man who drank a lot. That was exactly what was said in the police records about Tom's own father. And unfortunately, Michael had died just a few years before I'd got hold of his book, so I've not been able to confirm what the connection was, but it was you know, ranks in my life as one of the most extraordinary coincidences. Yes, and also while writing the book, I visited Arundel several times, and I would go in the pubs and chat to people. I especially targeted older people and would get them talking, and almost without exception, most of the people I spoke to were of the belief that Stilwell was guilty of this murder, although no one seemed to bear him any hostility. They just sort of like, oh yeah, of course he did it, that sort of thing. And I was talking to one guy one day, and he was about 90, and the publican actually said, oh Joe over there, he'll remember it all. And he shouted across to him, he said, Joe, did Tom do it? And he said, well, if he didn't, I expect Glenn Miller to walk in this pub any minute and order a pint. So this is the case that Lena presented me with when I first met her in 2010. As you can see, it's very creaky. Mr. Woodhouse's initials on the top. I don't expect, when I opened it in 2010, I reckon it's the first time it had been opened since the 50s. There we are. First of all, you see the biography of Fred Narborough. This book, in my opinion, drips with apology over the Joan case. And there's the another biography. This one's of the legendary Reg Spooner, who did the second investigation. Most poignant of all is this lovingly prepared photographic record of Joan's life from the cradle to the grave. Beautifully written tributes to Joan, and as you can see, photos. I mean, I've never seen so many photos of a child growing up. They're obviously very, very deeply loved. There she's I think the May Queen in that photo there. And then as you work through, you can see her growing up, May Queen again, trips to the seaside, trips abroad, and so on. That's the portrait that was used in the press a great deal. That's her great friend Lena as a young lady. Some of these are falling out. And this one is Lena with Nida and Nan, the formidable aunts of Joan, who would not let the matter rest when the establishment were trying to. Various birth certificates, marriage certificates, letters to various dignitaries. Nida and Nan and Joan Woodhouse must have been permanently at their old typewriters. And this is the original copy of the council's opinion, which they hoped would get the case reopened, but even that chap was ignored. And letters from the police, from the DPP, all sorts of people. And here, look, this is very poignant. This is Joan's rule of life. She lived by this. I will offer my day's work to God on waking. Pray for at least 5 minutes in the morning and at least 10 minutes at night. Say the company office and the society prayer each midday. Make an examination of the day's work each evening. Be at Mass on Sundays and make my communion at least once each week. Make 2 quarter-hour meditations each week. Make an annual retreat. Do 1 hour spiritual reading each week. Read a chapter of the Bible each day. Make my confession monthly. Seek out opportunities of helping others. Give at least 1/5 of my personal money to alms. Fast on Fridays and all other fast days. Keep account of my expenditure. Practice interior mortification. Be in bed by 11 p.m. Well, I should think the Pope would have trouble abiding by that. And to think the police were presented with this and much more evidence of Joan's absolute religious faith, Christian faith, Anglican faith, and they still thought she was a good time girl, and it's bizarre.
What puzzles me is a regular confession. What on earth would she have to confess?
Nothing. Very sad.
As the book Justice for Joan details, there were many more twists and turns in this mysterious case. However, the murder of Joan Woodhouse remains officially unsolved. Martin Knight lays out more information than has previously been in the public domain, through interviewing the descendants of the main protagonists and access to historical police files, and invites the reader to decide whether an innocent man narrowly avoided the gallows or whether a guilty man cheated the executioner.
It shows how a member of the public or members of the public tried to challenge the establishment and were basically downtrodden. They were dismissed and ignored, and they tried every single legal device there was. I'm not convinced that much has changed since 1948 and 1950 when that happened, and I think what else it shows, and I don't think it's conjecture, it shows that the police at that time put their own interests ahead of the public interest. They blundered in this investigation, and instead of putting that right, and they had opportunities to put that right with the second investigation, they stuck to their guns. So I think, again, I'm not convinced much has changed since 1948 on that score.
What about the establishment cover-up?
Yeah. And I think you see in the book the absolute power of the establishment and how they closed ranks and basically covered up this whole case, and in some ways that's quite terrifying.